right, thank you so much for being here, everyone. This is the first seminar as part of the Disability Across Disciplines seminar series of the Research Consortium on disability. So we are delighted for this first seminar of the year to have Yi Ding and Amanda Siegel present their work. So Yi Ding is professor of school psychology at Fordham University, and Amanda Siegel is a third-year school psychology PhD student at Fordham University. So Yi and Amanda, you have the floor, and we look forward to hearing about your research.
Okay, thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you everyone for attending. Again, my name is Yi Ding. I'm a licensed psychologist, and actually throughout, and I'm trained as a school psychologist, but also have a lot of experience working in pediatric clinics. And in my early career, I actually work in a learning disability and ADHD clinic. That's how I got interested in this very unique population. However, back then, I mainly work with younger one, K to 12, school age children. And then I met Amanda Siegel. She's a student with documented disability. I'm thrilled that many of my students, doctoral students actually have different type of documented disability. And we become very interested in terms of, how college level higher education can provide some support, structured support versus unstructured support in terms of how college student with learning disability can adjust to college life, their stress, coping. So that's how we come up with our research topic. First of all, I would really want to thank the funding from the Consortium on Disability Research that really gives Amanda and me a lot of support in terms of purchasing instrument and kind of providing incentives to participants. So thank you very much. So I will take care of the first half, and then Amanda will talk for the second half. So first of all, 1 in 5 individuals in the United States has been diagnosed with a learning disability. I used to work with the special education population a lot. And if you know K to 12 system, we use individualized education plan. So I usually ask my student, like a willing school system, for all these IEP students, do you know who make up the majority of the IEPs? SLD. Learning disability make up almost 50% of all of the IEPs, that are in our K to 12 school system. So I usually say a classroom with 20 students, you walk in, at least 3 to 5 of them will need some kind of instructional support. Those are likely the individual with a learning disability. And the trouble is it's invisible. When you see these students, when you work with them, they look normal, look typical, everything is fine. But you don't see the things struggle behind them. Specific learning disability, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder marked by cognitive impairment in at least one of the following domain. Could be spoken language, written language, math, so usually in school reflected through your academic performance in reading, writing, mathematics. And of course, reading, it's reading disability, or we call parentheses dyslexia. Usually it's in the largest subgroup within SLD population. And we all understand when kids are younger, things are easier because there's individualized education plan under IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is our special education law that protect all these K to 12 students. And for me, a frustration is once students hits that threshold, they go on to college. A lot of related accommodations or very intensive support disappear. For me, as a person with a special education background, I'm like, all of these supports go away, but these students, the disability don't go away. They are still individual with all these issues. Then what's going to happen afterwards? Even though Title III of American with Disability Act and Section 504 had mandated that all institutions of higher education needs to provide equal access to post-secondary education for students with documented disabilities. And my personal level, I think the support it's quite different from what we get from K to 12 systems. So many four-year college students with disabilities suffered, they have to kind of navigate through the system on their own. Fortunately, some four-year college offer very targeted support program for students with learning disability, and some of them don't. That's the reason we want to look into this topic. So we try to compare programs with very structured support for students with learning disability versus, they only have very generic, loose kind of support. There are a few factors that we want to look into in terms of college student. First of all, we try to utilize a questionnaire, a commercialized questionnaire that break our college adjustment into 4 domains. One is academic adjustment. I personally think it's very important. For example, a student going to engineering school, you need to have good enough preparation in mathematics, in some science basic classes. Otherwise, you are lacking those prerequisite courses, and then you're getting a lot of lower grades in engineering school because you don't have that academic readiness to go there. So academic adjustment is very important. And second is the social adjustment. I go to a school, I'm doing okay academically, but I don't have any friends. My professors are not supporting myself. I can't find a personal connection in that environment. And, I happen to look into some STEM college student. Interesting. Some people they have adequate GPA, and they still walk away from their program. Then what's going on above and beyond academic preparation? Is it because there's a social adjustment issue? Then personal and emotional adjustment. How much you can find a personal connection in that program. Do you get enough emotional support? When you need to get accommodations, are your professor open and flexible and try very hard to support you? And at the end, attachment to an institution, all right? If a student think that I really want to go to MIT, whatever top-notch university, and that person ended up in a community college, does that person form the attachment that I actually belong to this college? So that's another very important factor that we will kind of capture. The second level of the factor is the stress. I think, according to national data, 40% of college students report some levels of emotional stress, and about 20 to 25% actually is reaching the clinically significant threshold, which means, almost like 1 out of 5 of our students might even suffer from some kind of depression or anxiety. So sometimes I tell my students, you're not alone. Many students encounter that. It's just some students are open to discuss it, look for help, and some students don't. Okay, the third factor is coping. All right, we all, I think, pandemics is a fabulous example. Like we all encounter pandemics. We all got locked into our home. We can't go anywhere else. Then we can look at the same stressful events, but everybody responded to it differently. Like for me, when I was quarantined at home, I started taking the time and prepare for my licensure exam. I actually passed my licensure exam. Whoa, that's good for myself. So some people learn to divert their attention to something else. So the stressful event might not be so stressful. Some people choose to escape. Avoidance. It's a good strategy as well. I remember my father-in-law and mother-in-law. I like to give an example. They came to the United States. My mother-in-law tends to have a lot of demands, this and that. And I found a good strategy that my father-in-law used. He's like a passive avoidant. He pretended he didn't hear, or he hear and he could not remember. And eventually you just escape from those kind of demands, right? So many of us, choose using escape. There's not too much I can do with pandemics. I will just let it be. And that's also a coping. Some people are very planful. Oh, even before the pandemic start, I already started to, purchase masks, get all these, personal hygiene items. So I'm very well prepared for that kind of, stressful situation. So that's just a example. And at the end, the positive reappraisal is another kind of strategy. Say my students, some of my students tell me, okay, now I'm isolated, I'm at home, but I try to think about there are many people who lost a job. I still have a job. I still, could attend the classes online, and there were people who don't even have internet access. So there are different type of coping strategies a student can use while they are facing very stressful kind of events. And then there are other additional relevant behaviors such as school mail adjustment, social support, kind of, interpersonal relations, your self-esteem, self-reliance, other factors that can have an impact on college adjustment, and other factors like family support, extracurricular. So a few research questions that we formed. So first, we want to know, do college students with learning disability, if they receive structured programming to support their LD, having better outcome on these variable like adjustment, like levels of stress, ability to cope with difficult situation, like they have slightly better reports in comparison to students who do not receive structured support. Second, so of course our hypothesis is a student who are receiving these structured, support will have more positive adjustment, have better academic, outcomes, or better social adjustment. And the second hypothesis we have is students in those programs are more likely to engage in higher rates of adaptive strategies than those who are not in these programs. Okay, so the third hypothesis is a student in those programs will have lower levels of stress than students who are not in those programs by using the perceived stress scale. And hypothesis four is the students in those programs will have lower levels of school mail adjustment or social stress than those who are not in these programs. And the last hypothesis is student will have higher levels of interpersonal relations, self-esteem, self-reliance than those who are not there. Here are our measures that I will briefly explain. Undergraduate student, we target on age 18 to 24 who are enrolled in 4-year college with at least one diagnosed learning disability, because student could have a reading disability plus math learning disability, or just have a singular learning disability category. We have a screening tool to make sure that they are eligible. We utilize the student adaptation to college questionnaire. We use the perceived stress scale, and we use ways of coping questionnaire to look at their different, type of coping. And the last one, even though the name says behavioral assessment scale for children, actually in the scale had a kids version, adolescent, and adult version. So it does reach out to the adult population. Just in case you are wondering why we are using a children version, it has a children's name, but it covers up to college population. We went through our IRB and then started the recruitment through stratified sampling, and we use Qualtrics survey. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Amanda. Okay, you will just let me know when you are ready for the next slides, and you would just say next. Okay.
All right, thank you. So like Dr. Ding said, we had 5 hypotheses that we were evaluating. And because these hypotheses were one-sided or one-tailed, we used a series of independent samples t-tests to measure the impact of students who are enrolled in these programs, and then to compare their different scores and outcomes to students who are not in the programs. So just to reiterate the variables, our independent variable here was students' enrollment in these structured support programs. So they were either enrolled or not enrolled. And then there were 19 dependent variables. So this is each of the subscales of the different tools that we used, as well as the full scale scores that we can get from them. So before we did any of these analyses, we had to, of course, evaluate the assumptions of the statistical test. So we evaluated the assumption of normal distribution for all of the dependent variables. So looking at skewness And for participants who were in programs, the distributions were normally distributed, with the exception of the academic adjustment subscale, attachment to institution subscale, and social adjustment subscale. Those were all positively skewed. And then the full scale on college adjustment was also negatively skewed. Then looking at students who were not in programs, all of those distributions were normal, with the exception of the interpersonal relations scale on the BASC, which was positively skewed. So just keeping in mind, we need to be cautious when interpreting those results because that assumption has not been fully met. Second assumption that we looked at was homogeneity of the variance for each stratum within the independent variable. So looking at if there's equal variance in students in programs and then students not in programs. So this was done with Levine's test for homogeneity of variance. And this assumption was met for all of the variables. So this just lets us know that the assumption of equal variances has been met. We can go to the next slide. So now I'm just going to briefly talk through the results of these t-tests. So in the area of adjustment, the SACQ, or the Student Adjustment to College Questionnaire, attachment to institution subscaled, did have statistically significant results. So students in programs had higher scores on attachment to institution than those not in programs. Similarly, on the personal emotional adjustment scale, students in programs had higher scores than those not in programs in this domain. Go to the next slide, please. So then looking at the other areas we measured. So for stress, this is probably where we had the greatest difference noted. Students in programs did have significantly lower scores on the perceived stress scale, so indicating that they have lower stress than students not enrolled in these structured programs. Similarly, on the ways of coping questionnaire, the seeking social support subscale, scores were significantly higher for students in programs than not. And then on the BASC, or the behavior assessment system for children, the self-reliance scores of students in programs were significantly higher than those not in programs. And then just to talk a little bit about covariance, because I think it's important to look at those different variables that might be confounding our results. Like Dr. Ding mentioned early, there are other factors that play a role in the experiences of undergraduate students. These include family involvement, extracurricular involvement, and academic performance. One thing that's important to note is these factors and the way that they present, as well as how they're contextualized and measured, can vary really widely among individuals. This is more of a qualitative measure and a self-report. So an exploration of these specific factors was beyond the scope of this project. But just to kind of somewhat control for these impacts, a post hoc multiple analysis of variance was run to control for these impact of self-reported levels of family and extracurricular involvement, just to kind of get a better understanding. So when we controlled for family involvement alone, students in programs still had significantly higher scores on the personal emotional adjustment subscale of the SACQ and the seeking social support coping process on the ways of coping questionnaire. Then when controlling for extracurricular involvement alone, students in programs again still had significantly higher scores on that personal emotional adjustment subscale and the seeking social support coping process. Then lastly, we controlled for both of these variables together. And when controlling for both family involvement and extracurricular involvement, students in programs still had significantly higher scores on the coping process of seeking social support from the ways. So now go to the next slide. So just to kind of revisit our hypotheses and talk about what all this data really means. So the first hypothesis was that students in programs are going to have more positive adjustment. This was partially supported because students in programs had higher personal emotional adjustment scores, and attachment to institution scores. So this tells us that being in a structured program that can give support in the specific areas that are like most relevant to students with learning disabilities has a pretty significant impact on their sense of belonging on campus, as well as their ability to socially and personally adjust within the context of college. Similarly, on our second hypothesis, which was that students will have in programs will have higher rates of adaptive coping processes. This was again partially supported. Students in programs engaged more in the coping process of seeking social support. So looking at that, we know that when they have this supportive community and this structured community, they have others that they can look to for support and guidance when needed. So the third hypothesis was that students in programs will have lower levels of stress. This one was supported fully. Students in structured programming had significantly lower scores on the perceived stress scale. For the fourth hypothesis was that students in programs will have lower levels of school maladjustment and social stress. This one was not supported. We didn't have any significant differences. So that tells us that maybe these specific areas of the college process are not as deeply impacted by structured programming. And then for the final hypothesis, which was that students in programs will have higher levels of interpersonal relations, self-esteem, and self-reliance. Again, partially supported, students in programs had higher levels of self-reliance than those not in programs. So then now just to quickly talk about the limitations of the study, and just talk about sort of future directions as we continue research in this area. So there are several limitations of this project specifically, and of just kind of the systems and methods used in this project. So the first that I think is really important to address is that psychoeducational and neuropsychological assessments are just like largely inaccessible, the easiest way to say it. And this inaccessibility is really multifaceted. Evaluations are really expensive and costly. Many clinics have extensive waiting lists, meaning that you can't get in for several months, often even up to a year in certain places. And just the process of getting evaluated and diagnosed with a disability is a highly stigmatized process in our current society. So because of this, there is a population of students with undiagnosed learning disabilities. And because the eligibility criteria for the present study included a formal diagnosis and registration with the university's Disability or Accessibility Services Office, the experience of undiagnosed or self-diagnosed students with learning disabilities was not included in this. And it's also important to note that without a formal diagnosis, students are often unable to receive any accommodations or services through their school, so that can have a negative impact on their college experience. Additionally, the relatively small sample size of the present study made certain analyses to evaluate the impact of other factors. So that would be like age, race, different college majors, how long they've been in college, things like that. We weren't really able to accurately do those analyses due to the sample size. So the present study is serving as a pilot for a greater and larger study. And so in that, a larger sample size will be recruited. So again, as Dr. Ding mentioned earlier, recruitment for this study was done through stratified sampling. So because diagnoses of student disability status and all that information is confidential and private, the recruiting was done through staff at different schools' disability or accessibility services offices. And so they were asked to kind of invite students to participate and distribute the information. So as a result, participation was voluntary and participants completed the self-report questionnaire in its entirety at the time and location of their choosing. But I just want to note that students who did choose to participate may have had different motivations or life circumstances than those who did not participate or who started and never finished the survey. So for example, the length of the survey and the amount of reading required may have decreased the accessibility for students with language-based learning disabilities or reading-based disabilities like dyslexia. And so, although this feature is not currently available in the Qualtrics software, audio recordings of each question and response would increase the accessibility for the target population, which might yield more representative responses. So that's certainly something we're going to be looking into for future directions. In addition to formal structured programming, so while there isn't really a clear definition of what formal structured programming is, this tends to involve things like mentorship meetings, academic tutoring, scheduling sessions, things like that. In addition to those kinds of programs, there are also other forms of supportive programming targeted at students with disabilities, and many are actually designed specifically for students with learning disabilities. So examples of these programs would be on-campus affinity groups, as well as clubs and other extracurricular activities that can support students with learning disabilities. Students who participated in these programs were not directly targeted by the recruitment of this study. And if any participants were involved in this kind of programming, it wasn't evaluated independently of their structured enrollment program status. So future directions of this research would include looking at that third category of being involved in more extracurricular or unstructured programming. I also want to note that there were several limitations in regards to the specific instruments that were used. The student adjustment to college questionnaire instrument was originally designed for use with first-year undergraduate students. And the developers of that tool have not clearly demonstrated the effectiveness of using this tool for second year and beyond students, although in the literature, generally it is used for undergraduates as a whole. So just important to keep in mind that this tool may not be the most appropriate for all undergraduate experiences. It also is quite an old tool. It's more than 20 years old. So how we measure college experiences may be a little bit different and have kind of evolved over time. In addition, the Ways of Coping questionnaire, which was used to measure participants' usage of various coping processes, was developed based on the transactional model of stress and coping. And in that model, coping processes are classified as either problem-focused or emotion-focused. The model does not include other empirically based coping constructs, such as avoidance-focused coping. So as a result, those 8 coping processes that are measured on the Ways were grouped into the construct of avoidance-focused, emotion-focused, or problem-focused based on existing literature and our discretion as researchers. So as a result, there is likely some overlap in the constructs involved in the coping processes. So that's just something to keep in mind. And so now looking at future directions for this research, one of our biggest goals is to be addressing a lot of these limitations. In particular, increasing the accessibility of the survey using different assistive technology and software that can make it just more accessible to the target population, as well as increasing the sample size, including other kind of less structured forms of support programming, and then just continuing to recruit a diverse population. In addition, adding in qualitative methods would provide for a greater understanding of participants' lived experiences and just their individual perspectives. So research further research would include some mixed methods techniques to allow for students and participants to just share their genuine lived experiences in their own words and provide any additional information that isn't captured by these survey questions. And I just wanted to kind of wrap up with research in this area is really important because it provides contributions to both psychological and educational literature, and it has the potential to inform best practices for supporting both undergraduate students, but also graduate students and even students in the primary and secondary schools, and just in our best practices for supporting these students. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to reiterate the thank you that Dr. Ding extended at the beginning. Just wanted to extend our gratitude to the Research Consortium on Disability for their support for this project, And we wanted to thank you all today for your time and attention.